Hello, guys, and welcome to Stripping the Dipping. You're joined by your usual co host, Denzel Clarkson, aka DJ Denz, because here on Stripping the Dipping, we're recording straight bangers. And honestly, I'm very honored today to have our superstar guest back for a reappearance. It's the one and it's the only natural paradigm. It's Bryson Sullivan. Bryson, how's everything going? It looks like you've had a very incredible last couple of days. You went to the inaugural Miami Grand Prix and then made a sensational feature on the Sky Sports F1 channel as well. We've been so proud and excited for you.
Yeah, I'm having a good time of late. It's been a very busy couple of days, but I certainly enjoyed the time that I had in Miami, and I was happy to contribute to the conversation on Any Driven Monday.
Well, it was fantastic to see you there as well. Like, honestly, like, I'll give you my reaction as well. Like, I just tuned into it anyway, and I was like, okay, just watching Naomi Schiff, and I think Adam's the other guy in there as well. And usually they have like a guest come on. I was like, I wonder who's gonna be this week because they had Matt from WTF1. And then the next minute I was like, wait, I recognize that guy. It's Bryson. And I was like, oh my god, this is major. And I couldn't think of somebody that deserves that opportunity more because you're so highly admired within our community, and it's good as well to see you on these platforms and just your knowledge and experience and just kind of your thoughts just as like a great technical mind as well being acknowledged with that opportunity. So first thing I wanted to ask you, Bryson, is how did that like feature come about? What was the process involved in that?
Ironically enough, that was actually set up, almost a month in advance. I was actually originally intending to record that from my actual home, which is in Illinois. I wasn't even supposed to be in Miami that weekend, and then it was actually after that was already set up that it became possible for me to actually attend the Miami GP and physically go to the race, and then that folded in wonderfully with their reaction to the race. What happened? How did the American audience perceive it? What was it like at the track? Those were things that I could actually speak to because I was actually there. They didn't end up asking those particular questions when I was there, but I was happy to answer the questions that they did ask.
Oh, excellent. And again, just for those who live underneath a rock, know Dwayne Johnson, I do implore you to check that out as well because, it's amazing content. And if Bryson's on it, it has a lot of credibility as well. So we're super proud. And, leaning more towards the Miami side of it as well, Bryson, like, what are your first impressions of this inaugural GP? Because, I mean, there's been a lot of controversy to kind of do with the planning process or how they organized it. We obviously had Florida, Miami lawyer Malik on here a couple of weeks ago, which gave us some great insight into just the general neighborhood area and kind of the social context of growing up in that kind of side of the pond, I guess. But
Hmm.
in terms of the actual event itself, being there as a spectator and seeing the cars close up and even just the race as well. What were your impressions and what would you rate the race out of 10?
Yeah, I mean, I have been watching Formula One for more than 15 years, and the thing that's always drawn me to it is the performance of the cars. Right, the wheel to wheel racing is always great, but actually seeing these cars, which are the fastest cars in the world, around a Grand Prix circuit in person, it reminded me again that there's just no camera footage. There's no photo or video that really does justice to the dynamic nature of how fast these cars actually are, especially when you have, real time reference points like, W Series and Porsche Super Cup and even, expensive McLarens and Ferraris doing hot laps on the same track, pushing 10 out of 10, trying to go around. And then you see Formula One go by, and it's just a completely different universe as far as performance goes. So it's just wonderful seeing the cars and watching the drivers on the edge. In qualifying specifically, I was at the apex of turn four, which is after that sort of long sweeping, right hand of turn three, and then a little bit of a straight. And then the turn in is about, I don't know, 170 miles an hour. Just really, really phenomenal place to watch a Formula One car driven in anger. It was a really amazing experience. And I think one of the things that made the venue so impressive is that because it uses the existing infrastructure of the Hard Rock Stadium, the general admission ticket actually gets you a lot of access to a lot of different areas, and also areas that are elevated. If you want to see that, you can. There's several walkways that go up to the top of the stadium that would make great vantage points. There was tremendous things there that actually were very impressive. And I think one of the things that really is key about the way I experience Grand Prix is that I have to go to every single corner, and see the cars from every part of the track over the course of a Grand Prix, which means I'm walking around constantly, from corner to corner. I had to ration water a little bit because it was too hot, but I did make it to each of the corners. And there was just an incredible amount of stuff to do at this event. I know there's been much controversy about how much of it was pure celebrity themed and how much of it was real for real motorsports fans. But I can tell you, being there, that there was a huge fraction of the activities that were explicitly motorsports. Static car displays and pit stop tire changes and simulators. And I spent multiple days trying actively to do everything that I could, and I still missed like half of it, like fully half of the things that were there. So that was a really fun thing, and the Grand Prix itself was actually pretty exciting. Most of the action was actually in the midfield, so it's slightly different than I know Race Direction didn't do the best job covering it. But the final point that you mentioned, as far as Formula One and its relationship with the local community in Miami Gardens, as I've always said, if Formula One wants to be successful in the United States in the long term, it's not enough to be successful in winning your case in a court of law. You have to win in the court of public opinion as well. And Formula One, if Formula One is seen to be steamrolling local residents, or dismissing their concerns out of hand, it's not going to be successful, because people are going to recognize that and see F1 as an enemy of the local people. What I think needs to happen in terms of the communication is Formula One is definitely making efforts to improve things in the local community, investing in local STEM programs and inviting local businesses to do catering, and trying to some degree to help with noise mitigation. But this really needs to be the first step in several iterations of this. I really feel like there's no reason why the relationship between the local community and Formula One has to be adversarial by nature. It can be harmonious. It just requires some effort to do that. And I fully support any and all efforts to make that relationship as mutually beneficial as possible.
Absolutely, Bryson. And I'm really grateful that you touched on that too, because even just from the neutral perspective or just kind of watching it from the TV, but then hearing these stories as well, it's reassuring to know that, the voices of the people are going to be listened to. It's not going to fall on deaf ears. Like you said, there might be more conscious attempts now to integrate the community moving forward, and just the plans and any events that they have at this Grand Prix. Because it does have a lot of potential. And I'm really glad as well that you also touched on the sporting element, which is just as important, in terms of the dynamism of the cars. And even though essentially it's a racetrack that's built in the car park of the Miami Dolphins kind of
Well, to
stadium at
be
the
to
heart.
be to be fair, our car parks are pretty massive.
Yeah, compared to like
I,
our own.
we,
True.
we have some, and there actually are some elevation changes at the back of the circuit, believe it or not. But I must say, just to get this point out of the way, being there, seeing the campus that they erected, and how sprawling it was and how spread out it was, it didn't feel at all like a campus in the car park. It didn't feel like that at all. It felt remarkably well integrated. The track surface and the way it wound its way around the Hard Rock Stadium, and the way that the barriers were constructed, and the way that some of the other things that were already existing were sort of rolled into the plan that they have. Being on the ground there, it didn't feel at all like it was cheap or showy or anything else like that. I'm sure that there are some details involved as far as bookkeeping, and how much money they spent and how much they earned. But in terms of the actual product that they created, it was a phenomenal atmosphere.
I could imagine, and it definitely seemed that way as well, just with the number of people there. And also, shout out Mercedes for always just getting the stars, because we had Michelle Obama there, the first lady, and then I don't want to mess this up as well because I know there's going to be some Star Wars fans out there. But the director,
George Lucas was there.
Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say Matt Lucas, but I think that's a comedian. I'm glad I didn't say that because I would have got roasted. So thank you for bailing me out there, Bryson. But yeah, just it's incredible to see that. But of course, Bryson, I mean, it's great that it actually worked because that was gonna always be, I guess, the big test with such a kind of Grand Prix. But also, even when things go well, there's obviously still things which could be improved or maybe tweaked for next time. Just in your eye, Bryson, what do you think could be improved? Because to just flesh this one out a bit as well, we had a lot of commentary about maybe the nature of the chicane. I can't remember which turn number it was, but you've got essentially this like flowing right hand corner, like with a stadium right next to it, which I thought was really cool. And then you've got this really abrupt like chicane there, which a lot of people were alluding to it being like a almost like an interpretation of the Singapore sling, which I thought was quite amusing. And then other people as well talking about the Tech Pro barrier, maybe a need for that in the future, because again, there was a concrete barrier on the edge of the track, which collected Sainz and Ocon. Unfortunately, they had to just go for a quick medical trip, because they suffered that 51G impact and a lot of like controversy about that at the beginning. And on top of that too, there was like some resurfacing works that happened quite late before the race as well. At the end of sector 3, we saw that Bottas had a very slippery moment. And again, he was saying, "Oh, I just got distracted by the two Mercedes behind me. That's why I went off in that corner." But I think George was maybe a bit more cynical in saying that the I don't know if it's the material they used or just the compound or what it was they used in the tarmac. It just wasn't sufficient for what should be like a racing standard, I guess. So, what's your take on those comments? And was there anything else, in your opinion, that could be changed or maybe improved to, enhance the racing or just, the entertainment value, I guess, we see out of it?
Yeah, I think so. The first thing to talk about this that sector at the near the end of the lap where it's a very slow, chicanes and everything else like that. That really was not an accident. That was sort of done by design for two reasons. Number one, the presence of a turnpike and major highways right next to that part of the circuit means that any high speed corners would not be able to have a lot of runoff in that area. And the lower speed you can make the track at that particular point, the more safe it will be in general. But a wider point is that the circuit designers wanted to make a track that was difficult to set your car up in, meaning that it
Mm,
had a decent number of high speed, high downforce corners, which might require a stiff suspension setup, but also wanted to add a very slow speed section that would maybe favor a softer setup or a more compliant setup in your suspension. That would give enough of an opportunity for teams to choose divergent setups, and it may be a way to sort of spice things up in terms of how each individual team approached the circuit. This question that you mentioned of turn 13 and 14, where Signs and Ocon both had crashes. That's a particularly sensitive issue because it's not just that they crashed there, it's that the FIA response to their comments seemed to be incredibly dismissive. And it seemed to rely on the assumption of simulations providing the appropriate data, and tech pro barriers would actually make it worse, et cetera, et cetera. And I really think that drivers are actually far more brave and extreme than we might give them credit for. I was shown that by watching them drive these beasts of the cars around the track. If they say something might need improvement for safety, it's probably a good idea to listen to them.
of
Even if
course.
Tech Pro barrier itself isn't the perfect solution for that particular corner, maybe safer barrier might be appropriate. If the impact angle, the incidence angle is too low for Tech Pro to be the most appropriate solution, maybe safer barrier would be a good idea as opposed to pure concrete barrier. Because again, it wasn't just that Signs crashed and had difficulties with his neck. Ocon crashed and he cracked his chassis. That's a big impact. Even if the speed seems low, there seemed to be a disconnect between the barrier configuration and what the cars were doing. In terms of the track surface coming up, that happened multiple times. You said that it was sort of repaved and redone before the beginning of the event. It's actually worse than that. They actually
Oh,
tore it up. They actually tore it up again at the end of qualifying at night, and then laid it down again before Sunday. but
wow.
that's not that's not entirely unheard of. If you remember, in Canada, 2007 and 2008, and I remember even at Spa many years ago, they had issues with tarmac coming up. So that can happen from time to time, and honestly it kind of makes the racing a little bit more interesting to me. I know it can make overtaking offline a bit more challenging for sure. But I like to see a hard move it kind of extends the braking zone if the grip isn't quite as good. In terms of what I might suggest in terms of improving the event or modifying it in the future, the most immediate thing to me would be to either make the race earlier in the year when the temperatures aren't quite as hot, or consider the possibility of a twilight race or a night race. There were multiple reportings of people that I spoke to personally, and many others who I didn't speak to personally, where people were just becoming dehydrated. They were running out of water. Some people were, fainted and they collapsed, and other people required airlift to, hospitals and things. It was just very, very hot. And I'm sure part of that has to do with people's expectation of how much water they might need, right, in that particular race versus how much they actually needed. Notwithstanding alcohol-based dehydration, which is a separate question. But no, I think this particular race could actually be equally spectacular, if not more spectacular, in a twilight setting or at night. And it would actually make things a lot easier for the people who were actually there, because it was just extraordinarily oppressively hot for the fans, and I can't even imagine how it must have been for the drivers.
Well, Bryson, again, you're there with your crystal ball, man, because I've got a couple of things to cook the FIA upon on this episode, and drinks and drivers not having them in the race. It's one of them, so we will make a circle back to that later. I'm just letting the FIA marinate for a bit, you know. But I definitely, I definitely hear you on the other bits as well. I think those are some superb suggestions, and I think this for the customer or the fan perspective as well is quite important. You know that the fans' health and safety, is taken into consideration as well. Because Danica Patrick was talking about it as well, and I think there was a couple of spickles of rain in the air as well before the race started. And Danica was like, "Oh, it's so hot here, the rain won't even go on the floor; it would just evaporate immediately." I was like, "Wow, we could only live to dream of something like that in the UK with the kind of
It's
mild
true, but
conditions
she
we
she
have."
is completely right. It's almost like trying to figure out a good analogy for it. Singapore or Malaysia might be good reference points for what the environment was like in Miami.
Wow. That is, yeah, that is, it's eye opening for sure. Because you kind of get the impression from watching it on TV, but still, I guess you really have to be there to just like soak that in. And of course, like, and even just on the commercial aspect of it, you mentioned on top of that, maybe it being like a twilight race. We had not the FIA, we had the Miami Grand Prix ceremonies a couple of days before the race took place. And again, there was lots of DJing, like lots of like partying and stuff like that. I could see there being a market, or like, even a more intrinsic fascination with maybe having the first American night race as well. So even from that factor, I think it'd be really cool to extend the possibility of looking into that in the future as well. So really glad we touched on that. And with no further ado, we're going to move into our tech segment. So, Georgina, our lovely founder, has done some very extensive research, which I always find impressive. There's quite a few things just like specific to this Grand Prix, Bryson, but also just generally she's identified as well. So let's get into some of those. So the first thing that Georgina's observed and wanted us to go through was the flexible floor edges. So for example, we believe that McLaren has like almost like a curtain on the floor, basically on the edges of the floor. It looks like some sort of device or intrinsic attempt to kind of seal the kind of like, I guess, suction or the downforce to the floor of the car. How does this really work? And could this also be used as a technique to resolve porpoising, or in some cases could it actually exacerbate the problem?
I mean, there's two things that I would say is that just because we see something on a car and it moves in a certain way, that doesn't necessarily mean that its original intention is result of the way that it moves. So,
Mm.
for example, you mentioned that there's like a piece of the floor on the McLaren that's kind of it's almost like it curls upwards and it's sort of on hangers on the edge of the floor. That actually has some interesting aerodynamic properties that may be totally separate from its compliance that we have to kind of consider. The flexibility of the floor and in fact it moving down and actually touching the ground, while it is true that that could seal the floor from any higher pressure outside of it, you have to be careful because if it does so too much, right, if the pressure under the floor is too severe, there could be an adverse pressure gradient there that actually causes the flow to separate and break down under the floor, which would cause you to lose downforce instead of gaining more of it, which could actually kick off this porpoising question. And then on the other end, in the case that it doesn't actually flex, any flow that is going sort of outwards tends to extract flow outwards in the same direction underneath the floor. That can also be a beneficial thing for producing downforce there locally. So part of that happens sort of on the mid floor, and part of it happens in the back of the floor. Without any more detailed information about McLaren CFT, I can't specifically say anything about that. But with regard to porpoising, what I can say is that I did have direct observation of the cars at high speed on the run down to turn 11 on that sort of long bending straight at the south end of the circuit. There's a couple of gaps in the barrier where I can look down and see directly down. And honestly, the porpoising really didn't look anywhere near as bad this weekend as it did in Imola or any other weekends. And so that was generally quite good. I think the teams are getting kind of a handle on that as time is going on, but it's still something to consider. I know Mercedes brought several updates, including a new front wing, a new rear wing, and a new beam wing as well. Those weren't specifically targeted for porpoising. They're more about reducing drag. But one of the consequences of that seemed to be having, better porpoising performance, at least in the race. Although there were a couple of times where I saw George's car was a little, a little more bounce happy than I would personally like.
Sure. And just in relation to the porpoising topic as well, Bryson, another kind of question to tie into this one is Ted Kravitz made a quite interesting observation the other day. And whilst I'm not quite sure it has many legs to stand on or it is true, he was suggesting that perhaps one of the many things that could be causing this current W13 to be behaving the way it is with its minimal side pod design, there's not much surface area that connects like the barge board to the floor. There's like a lot of kind of open floor area that's just exposed and only really supported by these two stays, like these metal rods that connect the floor to like the, I guess, the rear part of the chassis almost, or bodywork.
It's the gearbox, I believe.
Yeah, just like, do you think that that could potentially have anything to do with the way the car's performing? Because to kind of caveat that, you were saying that with Ferrari's more wide, like side pod, and the way that that kind of like, I guess, merges into the floor, there's less exposed like surface area on the Ferrari that can flap up or down or move under turbulence or like high load. So do you see anything in that? Could it potentially? I mean, it won't. If it was so simple, I'm sure Mercedes would have figured that out. But what do you think of that take, just generally?
There's no question that having more exposed floor limits the ways in which you can support it. Because remember, you can't only have two of those stays that are outside towards the rear of the floor to keep it upwards. But if you could have a wider side pod, you actually can use multiple stays that are interior to the side pod to actually hold up the floor. And in fact, when Ocon had floor damage, or excuse me, side pod damage, and when Alonso had side pod damage, we actually have pictures showing internal floor stays that are used to keep their floor together for the Alpine. So that's certainly something to consider. However, it can't possibly be as simple as Mercedes side pod design is the reason for their porpoising problems, because the Barcelona specification version of the car that we saw in preseason testing also had porpoising. we
True.
we weren't talking about it quite as much at the time, but it's a matter of fact that that previous version car with wider side pods did have porpoising. Not only that, but look at Ferrari, look at Haas, look at several of the other teams that have more traditional side pod designs that are much wider. They also had extreme porpoising as well, right? It can't be as simple as Mercedes has a very shrunken side pod design. And if they were just to simply expand it to a more traditional side pod design, they wouldn't have any porpoising problems because number one, the previous version of the car that we saw in Barcelona had porpoising, and number two, other cars that have more traditional side pod designs also have severe porpoising. You know, Ferrari and Haas are good examples. So I think the problem is a bit more complex than that. It also is non-trivially related to the floor design itself, not only in the aerodynamic shaping of the contours and where there are local pressure peaks and the velocity distribution underneath the floor, but also maybe mechanically, you know, something that we thought we saw on Red Bull's floor seemed to be these sort of metal skates that were located at the rear of the floor that appeared to slide on the floor and prevent the absolute minimum distance between the floor and the ground from getting below a certain level, which could prevent the floor from, you know, stalling to begin with and kicking off this porpoising issue. So I think there are many variables to this problem. I simply don't believe that it could be reducible to the single variable of side pod design.
I absolutely agree, and I was thinking that too. Like, yes, it could be a contributing factor, but I don't think it's the one ingredient that is, necessarily the cause of action for what's going on with that car. So I agree 110% with all the things you've mentioned, and in a way, it's probably a combination of things combined, which is not helping it. And then you rightly also mentioned that there are other cars that are suffering from porpoising, but yeah, it doesn't seem to be as severe or affect the reattaching and detaching of the aero characteristics of the W13 is under braking, under acceleration, on straights, and so forth as well. So really interesting discussion there. And then the next element of the tech segment we wanted to look into as well, Bryson, was and you alluded to it as well. I'm gonna call it. I know it's not like the tech. It's not the techie kind of word for it, but I'm gonna name it the Mercedes P wing because to me it kind of looked like the edge of the end plates on the front wing because they were detached kind of from the actual body of the front wing. It kind of looked a bit like a P shape, so I'm just gonna go with calling it the P wing. But
Hey,
yeah, could you
I'm not going to stop you, man.
thank you. I might even try and pattern it afterwards. So we'll see. But yeah, Bryson, could you elaborate further on what Mercedes were trying to achieve with this newer upgrade and kind of what benefits that might have, obviously, for the upcoming Grand Prix we have?
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting what they did. I think, you know, in 2022, there's a regulation that the front wing has a maximum of four elements, and that those elements join directly with the end plate. There's no longer a situation where we can just have four, then it stops, and then, you know, doesn't at some point join with the end plate. We all kind of assumed that that would mean that the teams would extend those elements out sort of sideways, laterally, and then sort of transition them at the radius that they're supposed to, you know, into the end plate. It seems very straightforward. What Mercedes brought with their front wing to Miami was instead of having the four elements of the wing, you know, extend radially outwards or laterally outwards, the final two or three of those elements right towards the edge, they sweep very aggressively forward at like 45 degrees or more, so that the actual attachment points for all four elements are actually within the first half of the chord of the end plate. And the second half of it is just open. There's almost like a wedge shaped opening at the back end of the end plate, which is actually quite interesting. And this is one of the reasons why the show and tell, you know, sessions of 2022 have actually been quite useful, because we actually have explicit information from Mercedes as to what that design change is about. And I think I had a post about it. But essentially, this is designed to improve the front wing efficiency by reducing the pressure differential between the top and bottom surfaces of the wing right at the wingtip. So, as I mentioned in previous discussions, wings create multiple types of drag. You can sometimes call profile drag and induced drag. Induced drag is a drag associated with actually creating lift. It's an unavoidable consequence of it. And the more loading you have of the wing towards the tip, the worse that induced drag tends to be. And so, if you can unload the wing to an extent, you might be able to improve its efficiency, which is to say, you can reduce the amount of drag that it creates for a certain amount of downforce. Not only that, but the physical gap that design produces actually allows air to escape sort of sideways in front of the front tire, which actually creates outwash. And one of the cool things about aerodynamics is you can make a change. You can make a change in the front of the tire, and it impacts the flow behind the tire as well. That actually can lead to outwash behind the tire, which can have beneficial effects for the current car, but it might make things a little bit more difficult for the cars following. So it's certainly an interesting design, certainly something that I think the structural engineers spent a few late nights trying to wrap their heads around to make sure it wouldn't come off in an incident. But it seems to be all about reducing drag and improving the efficiency of the wing. We'll see if other teams pursue something similar to this, but it certainly is a very interesting design. And if I find some more pictures of it, I'll share it. But it's a really impressive example of Mercedes developing their car in addition to just finding new ways to optimize the car that they already have.
Absolutely, I solidly agree on that as well. And even just from like a non-technical point, Bryson, as well, I'm glad that they brought it because amongst the Mercedes fans, I feel there is a kind of thing of what are they gonna do? Like, what are they gonna try and do? What can they add to this car? What can they do to improve it? What can they do to make it faster? So, obviously, we all know and appreciate that they're doing stuff internally behind the scenes, but it's always nice when you can optically see a visual kind of change with the car as well. And that was quite a visual one that was quite noticeable to a lot of us. So yeah, like and like you mentioned as well, there's so many benefits with just how you can control the outwash of the air coming off the tire and so forth as well around the rest of the body of the car as well, and make it kind of perform in ways that you need it to. Which I think again, like we haven't come to that question just yet, but for like a high downforce circuit like Barcelona, I think might prove to be very critical. So I'll be looking forward to see how that works over the course of the season and what races they bring it for and what races they tend to just go for a more traditional design. But then just to end this tech segment as well, Bryson, another observation that the great Georgina Donna made as well, and I think it was also brought up in Sky Sports too, was there's been some controversy around Red Bull. There always usually is, to be honest. So I don't know why I said that with so much allure. But Red Bull also was spoken about quite a lot of the weekend because they introduced, perhaps it could be new, it might just be something that they've had but not really been seen by the public yet. It happened to be like a new front and rear brake drum duct to deal with like the hot Miami conditions. But just for the fans at home, Bryson, could you explain how like a drum duct works in the brakes, and also like why teams might try and like push for the legality of it, if it's like legal or not legal? And is it innovative in what they're trying to do, or is this something that we've seen even like previously with different iterations of brake ducts, or the way that the drum is used in that kind of fashion?
Yeah, it is quite interesting because it's not just a question of thermal management of the brakes, but it's also a function of the aerodynamics of the car itself. As I mentioned before, generating outwash in general is a good thing for a Formula One car to improve its own performance. It has negative impacts on the performance of the car behind it, but outwash, if you can generate it, is generally speaking a very good thing. Not only can you generate that with the span wise distribution of loading of the front wing, or having barge boards in the previous generation of cars. But actually, in the old days, you could actually blow the cooling flow of the brakes through the axle, right through the wheel, and blow that outwards. That also creates outwash that can have beneficial aerodynamic effects for the external air of the car, and that could also allow you to get some of the heat from the brake into the wheel rim and heat the tire ultimately. But that's actually all been cut back in 2022, right? Precisely because they understood that outwash creates problems for cars behind. The FAA has been trying to explicitly prevent teams from doing that, from exploiting it too much. And so the new brake ducts that the cars have currently, they don't have a duct on the inside part of the wheel that sort of shoots air out the axle, out the outside part. Now the air comes in the inside sort of brake duct. It then is sort of routed around the interior of the wheel in a sealed way, and then it's routed out again on the backside of the of the inboard part of the wheel, which is completely different than the way it used to be handled before. And in principle, there shouldn't actually be any mechanism by which to sort of blow air through the axle of the wheel. However, Red Bull does seem to be having some, I don't want to say extra legal ducting, but certainly some ducting that's in addition to what we would normally expect to see, where they may actually be able to get some air through the wheel. And again, I've only seen some pictures and some crude drawings of how this might work, but it is a mechanism that you could use to bypass the traditional flow paths that you expect to see in the front brake duct and actually produce a bit of outwash in a way that's legal, if not exactly what the rule designers intended, it certainly might meet the word and the letter of the definition, which is really all that matters in the end. But broadly speaking, not only can that improve outwash, which can improve the performance of your own car, but as I said before, it might also lead to the ability to direct some of the heat from the brakes into the wheel rim, which has beneficial aspects for tire warm up as well, which is something that many teams have been struggling with. Mercedes, not least of them.
Oh, of course, and it's interesting this how it has benefits for them, like you mentioned, and even though what the I guess the regulators and the kind of technical people have done for the FIA is to try and take away some of those benefits and to kind of reduce the negative outwash that's going to be just bestowed onto a following car. But even still, they're really obsessed with trying to at least regain that performance back or at least simulate that kind of performance, even with this new loophole that they've managed to find as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that carries out, whether the FIA allow it and then other teams try and copy it or make their own version of it as well. And it's just intriguing because again, it's not really a part of the car that we can see with the naked eye. But at least when the RB16 or 16, that's 2 years ago. I need to get in the future. The RB18 is on the jacks and it has the wheels off. You can start seeing these finer details with the. It's like a cake tin as well with those brake ducts.
Yeah, I just if people are interested in researching this, I would highly recommend the technical images from Motorsport that Matt Summerfield usually writes articles about. Giorgio Piola also does fantastic technical drawings of these parts that are very helpful in understanding mechanically what we're actually looking at. If we only start with a couple of pictures, so those would be my recommendations.
Absolutely. And for the listeners at home as well, I would implore you to do that as well because there's a lot. And I think for me, I would also say that I'm like more of a visual learner too. So obviously, you have somebody amazing like Bryson giving you this information and these nuggets of just gems. But then when you have the kind of visual aspects as well to go with it, it makes a lot more sense in terms of what these designers and engineers are trying to achieve as well, which is quite remarkable. But then moving on to the next segment of the show, Bryson, I always enjoy this bit as well. It's our fan questions. We've got quite a few of them. Like, I guess they, they must have known that you were coming. So there's quite a few of them, and I think that you'll be intrigued. So let's get on with those. So the first one, Bryson, was about the Mercedes strategy blowback of such. Because to set the scene, um, you know, they managed almost on I think it was Saturday to get that W13 into a more manageable window. Because in one of the sessions, if I remember correctly, Russell was P1, and we're like, wow, okay, this beast that we're talking about, it's this there, and they're really close to unlocking it. And then when it came to qualifying, it seemed like maybe they made some further adjustments. Maybe they tried to lower the ride height. There's some suggestions of that as well. And whatever they did, it seemed to just take the car of this very narrow performance window it has. And when Russell went for his Q2 lap, it just wouldn't hook up. It just wouldn't connect. The car was just like, nope, I'm not doing any more work today. My work's done here. So you had Russell kind of a bit further back than usually be. But then, thankfully for us, Lewis still put in a very, very satisfying lap. And although, again, not quite, in the top three, we know the limitations of this car, and he still finished practically best of the rest outside of the Red Bull and Ferrari camp with Bottas alongside him for company. So then we get to race day, and I guess the common sense thing would have been to put Russell on the hard tire and make him go long in preemption that there would have been a safety car. Whereas Lewis would have gone with the more conventional kind of start on the medium tires, and there was I think most people would have opted for the one stop. Some people also were considering of stopping twice, potentially to go for the more aggressive strategy. So you've got all of that, and then I want to get your view on this as well. You then have this crazy incident between Gasly and Norris, which I think happened quite close to where you were in the stands too.
It
which
did.
triggers the safety car. Go on.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it did happen quite close to me. That's all I was going to say. But please finish your question.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, and then so before that incident happens, a lot of the midfield runners and riders have already pitted. I think Valtteri's already pitted, Lewis is already pitted, and then the team even was saying to George, you want to come in, and he said, I'm a betting man. I'm gonna gamble. I think even though we're not in Las Vegas, I think I'm just gonna gamble it a bit more and just wait. Something has to give. We're leaving it with something, as Denzel would say. And then boom, safety car. So Russ was able to obviously pit under that because they were pitting under a safety car. The amount of time you'd lose in a pit stop is like significantly less than it would be in normal racing conditions, of course. So he managed to keep the track position, or if I remember, no. So was it a situation? I can't remember if he came out behind Lewis or he was
He
still in
did
front
come
of
out
Lewis.
behind, but he was right behind, and he had a massive tire
Tire
advantage as
advantage,
well.
right? But then to get to the crux of this question, Bryson, because this is where I would say there was a lot of split kind of views on it. Bono comes on the radio, and all he really says to Lewis is, yeah, mate, do you fancy some softs? To which Lewis now, which I could fully understand, and this poor guy, he's like, dude, like, what's the position? Like, if I come in for these soft tires, what position would I come out in? What's the gap? How many cars do I have to overtake? You've given me this proposition, but you've not really explained to me what the pros and cons are. To which at that point, it's already becoming too late. And they say, well, yeah, you're gonna lose track position, stay out anyways. And I feel a lot of people in the community, they're quite cross because they were saying, well, they should have pitted Lewis for the soft tires, and rather than taking the responsibility for the call and actually instructing Lewis to come in, they said, well, like they just kind of like left it on Lewis. And then you had other people saying, even if Lewis had pit for the soft tires, he'd have lost track position, and it would have been really hard for him to get those positions back. Chances are you would have probably still ended up behind Russell anyways, and the team still finished P5 and P6. So whether it was Russell in P5 and Lewis in P6, or Lewis in P5 and Russell in P6, it's the same number of points. So why does it matter? So what's your take on that? Because it was very, I saw some heated group chats, and I'm glad that I just didn't say anything because I don't want to get cooked.
So let's start from the beginning. As you mentioned, Russell had a very challenging qualifying, and I think at the beginning of the race he was even P16 at one point on that first lap. If you're gonna start so far down the grid, it makes all the sense in the world to adopt a counter strategy, one that would take you very long into the Grand Prix and would benefit you if there happens to be a late race safety car. Not only that, but the way that the energy is taken out of the tires depends on how much fuel weight you have on board. So if you have soft tires in the beginning of the race, you wear them down much more quickly than you would if you were to put them on towards the end of the race. So broadly speaking, it can always benefit you if you can run long on harder rubber toward the beginning of the race. The reason why people don't do that is because if anyone around you starts on soft, you're going to lose track position, and if it's difficult to overtake someone, you may lose a place that you will never get back. That's the reason why Lewis didn't try it. It's the reason why no one in the front tried starting on hards, is because it just doesn't really make sense when you're that far up the grid. But George staying out longer, certainly starting from as far back as he did, it would actually make sense to be the beneficiary of any late race safety cars that happened. And hey, guess what? It did happen. It's not necessarily. I mean, it certainly is lucky, but you're putting yourself in a position to be able to take advantage of that sort of luck. I was watching Lewis's sector times sort of after the race when I rewatched this. I don't think he would have been able to extend on the medium tires much more than he already did. So he really just had to pit, and there was quite a large gap in between when he pitted and when Russell was able to pit in the end with Norris's issue. What I would say about the issue between Norris and Gasly, I think part of that may actually be related to the heat and the fatigue that the drivers were experiencing. These drivers are keeping track of their car balance and wind direction and how where they're losing time to their competitors and what are the gaps. They're playing chess at 300 kilometers per hour, add on top of that the sweltering heat that was in Miami, and towards the end of the race, I can imagine, a slight lapse in concentration that resulted in an accident. So it's not like Gasly was doing anything deliberately. It's not like that, but it's just something that can and did happen. I must say that when it happened, I actually thought it was Ricardo that crashed, because it turns out that without the aid of the television and because people have custom helmets, I couldn't actually quite tell who had crashed when I was looking down the track. But
And
it
everybody
turned,
had like a Miami helmet as well. Like
yeah,
everybody.
yeah, I think I would have figured out if I looked a little bit longer. But the other intangible fact that people don't realize about going to races is you're only looking at the track through fences, right? So it's
Mm,
it's difficult to see in the best of times. But I'm also looking through a chain link fence to try to figure out who crashed, and I just couldn't do it. Regarding Russell, I mean, I think there's been, ample evidence of the past, several races that he's just been incredibly lucky in terms of how the cards have broken for him in terms of safety cars and crashes and when things have come out. But at the same time, let's be clear, he has been lucky from those things, but he's also been close enough for those differences to actually make a difference,
sure.
right? So which is to say, if Lewis was 10 seconds up the road, it wouldn't matter if the person behind him pitted under a safety car because he's still going to be in front of them, right? George has been objectively lucky in many of the races thus far this season, but you have to give him credit for being close enough for that to actually make a difference in their finishing order. So I think that's how I would say in terms of people being upset about Mercedes' strategy. I mean, that really is a Mercedes internal issue, really. If Lewis feels that he did not have enough information to make an accurate decision, he's really the best person, or at least the person in the best position to say whether or not that's accurate. And I tend to think he's probably right about that. Mercedes is Mercedes can definitely improve its game on the strategy side and the tactics side. I think they can be more aggressive and perhaps slightly more responsive to some information that they are provided. Lewis is an impressive figure. He knows incredibly so much about racing, but there's a limit to how much he can be relied upon to make decisions. And it's not necessarily because you want to put blame on one person or another for a decision that doesn't happen to turn out. It's just that Lewis knows what he's talking about a lot of the time. He's a good
Sure.
person to go to. So I think that there can definitely be some give and take in terms of how the team finds itself in moving forward and adopting strategies that maximize the points. I think the real benefit of a W13 is that despite it not really being on the pace where we'd like it to be, it's had really no reliability issues to speak of that I can think of. And that's actually so incredibly important when you think about where Red Bull is and the issues that they've been having this season. Even in Miami, Sergio Perez had a power issue that very likely prevented the Red Bull from getting a 1-2. Mercedes has so far avoided that. And if they can continue doing that, I think they'll be in a good position going forward. This upcoming race in Barcelona will give a very good indication as to how the middle part of the season is going to go. Barcelona is traditionally the biggest upgrade that the teams give to the cars, at least the first major upgrade. I expect the running order to shift slightly. I don't know who's going to be on top or how it's going to work, but it will give us a much better indication of how the next 5 or 6 races will go.
Absolutely. And yeah, lots to take away from that one as well, just in terms of how the team move forward. I feel as well like it's always a thing of communication is key. And I don't know if it's maybe time for a reshuffle. Maybe it's the fact that they're now more in the midfield. Well, not, I wouldn't say midfield, but they're not really on the top step quite yet. So they're being thrown new challenges that they haven't had for quite a while. And it's this kind of bit rusty and kind of readjusting to that particular scenario. But of course, you don't become 8-time world champions, just on pure luck. This is a well greased and a heavily driven machine as a team. And I'm sure that, they'll be sitting down looking at the telemetry, thinking about the communication processes as well. This is to what's meaningful and useful when they're having these dialogues and these very high pressured moments too. Because as fans as well, I think we need to remember that all of these things happen within tenths of a second, and getting it wrong or right could literally just be just so marginal on occasion. So I absolutely agree with the response you've given there as well. Like, I don't think it's for us to allocate blame or for us to kind of go on a witch hunt of saying who's responsible. But yeah, it is an interesting thing. And when you're not winning, I guess it makes you take heed of the things that you could do differently as well. So there's positives to be taken away from that too. So moving on to the next fan question, and it's not necessarily about a Grand Prix, it's an observation a fan made. Bryson, they wanted to know about the front nose duct, and I was thinking about how am I going to describe this to Bryson because he knows where it is, but for me to explain it that so he gets it, and then the fans at home get it. I want people at home to think of like the Ferrari and just like on the front nose, just underneath the prancing horse, it's like an incision. It's like a square, or like it's like a little hole, almost. And the AlphaTauri have it too. Like you've got obviously the front nose, and then right on the tip, there's like a kind of like slot gap where it looks like air could pass through. Some could speculate that maybe it's perhaps for driver cooling, or it might blow air into the cockpit, maybe. Um, but what's the function of this like front nose duct, Bryson, on those particular models I mentioned, and did they serve any other purposes other than maybe try like cooling the driver?
Yeah, I mean, we in the old days we would have a proper S duct, and an S duct is a duct that has an opening either in the front of the nose or somewhere in the bottom where it can sort of help the boundary layer stay attached to the bottom of the nose, and also a direct flow towards the top of the nose where the corner was to help the flow prevent it from separating up there as well. We don't really have proper S ducts anymore in 2022, sort of by regulation, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if they have ductwork in there to aid in driver cooling or even electronics cooling, depending on how far the ducts go and how it works. I haven't really seen enough of their CAD and things to know exactly where it's going, but I would think that driver cooling is a good estimation, specifically in the footwell where the pedals are. But also, there's also more than one type of duct. There's actually a very specific type of duct that looks sort of triangular and has a flat sort of bottom to it and curved sides and sort of is recessed down. You may have seen that's actually called a NACA duct. It was developed by the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics in the United States, which is the precursor to NASA. And that was actually designed as a way to have improved airflow from a minimally exposed duct with minimum drag. It's used very, very often in aviation and motorsports, but I've seen a few of those on some of the cars as well for cooling and for other reasons. The short answer I'm going to say is that it's probably related to cooling, and I don't have any more information to speculate beyond that. But I know it's not a traditional S duct because those are not really allowed by design currently.
Sure, and just whilst you were speaking there as well, Bryson, just on the topic of like ducks and like a hole that's mounted in the front nose cone. I don't know if you will remember this, and I've actually sent you the article as well via DM. Like, did you remember the Mercedes W duct? So I think it was on the W03 back in like 2012. Mercedes had like a little hole in the front nose, like a mouth almost, which cold air would pass into and then feed into these tubular ducts that would like basically act as a double DRS on the front wing. Like,
Yeah, I have seen that and I do remember it. It's slightly more complex than that. I think the key thing to remember about that is not so much the hole in the front of the nose. It's actually those two pylons that are used to go down and mount the wing. Those are actually hollow. Those actually had air ducts within them that were actually designed to pipe air in a way underneath the bottom of the front of the wing that would in fact cause it to stall, and of course that would reduce your downforce, but it would also reduce drag as well. So that there were definitely multiple mechanisms for creating DRS like functionality. I mentioned to you that Matt Summerfield was one of the people to talk to about many things technical. He is in fact the author of this article, which you have sent me. So I would definitely point you towards his direction to get a feel for how it works. It is kind of like DRS, but I would almost say it's more because we think of DRS as like a flap based actuation, right? Where it's like you have a flap and then the flap changes position and that changes the drag characteristic. It's almost a lot more like the F duct, right? From 2010. Do you remember the F duct that
Yeah,
McLaren had
had.
and Ferrari had with the very controversial hand off the steering wheel at 300 kilometers per hour because they were stalling the rear wing? I think that's a much better way to think about this mechanism that Mercedes was using on that particular car in their front wing. It's a deliberate ducting of air in a certain direction at a certain time that could be used to improve the characteristics to reduce the drag in a straight line. So I definitely do remember that, and it was definitely pretty cool. Although I'm pretty sure it was banned the very next year.
Yeah, I don't think the FIA were too happy about it, and there was a lot of like complaints and legality kind of things to do with that as well. Because when like if my memory serves me right, the Mercedes that year in qualifying was so rapid. It was a joke just how much straight line speed and obviously like low drag that car had just with the cool quirks and features with the duct as well. So yeah, just I thought it'd be cool to throw that in there too because as soon as I saw the question, I was like, it's been quite a few interesting front noses with like holes in them, and like you said, some of them are more conventional, and some of them do really weird and wacky stuff. But we
And
love
just
it
to be
all.
clear, I'm not going to dismiss out of hand the possibility that something like this is happening now. I don't know. I just
Mhm.
don't have the information to make any strong claims about it. So I would take a more conservative guess for right now.
Sure, and that's fair. No one can have that expectation. I don't think that'd be right of someone to kind of bestow that on you as well, have that expectation. So I agree with you. But then on to the next question, Bryson. And actually, I'm gonna do my best Bryson Sullivan impression on the show. Like, you gotta let me know, Bryson, if I'm good with this one. Because the question is, what is the best turbo? Split turbo or the traditional turbo that Ferrari uses. So here's where I'm gonna try and be you for, for a minute in explaining it to the people at home, and you could jump in and let me know if I've done a good job. So essentially, with the traditional turbo that a team like Ferrari uses, you've got a compressor wheel and then a turbine which is connected by a short shaft, and they basically are housed respectively like back to back. Whereas Mercedes at the beginning of the turbo hybrid era kind of realized that there's like a multitude of different gains they could have by splitting it in two halves. So you had a compressor, which was mounted at the front of the engine, and then the turbine that spins on the rear. So with that in mind, there's like multiple different ways you can, I guess, probably to do with heat or maybe to do with like the way it converts energy. I imagine this is probably where I'm going to stall out now. I'm going to hand it to you. But am I along the right lines in explaining that? And yeah, I'd give you the floor to answer that one as well. It's still
Yeah,
which one's better.
I think you definitely are, and I think the hint as to why this might be such a good idea is to think about what an intercooler is in a turbocharged car, right? You have an intercooler because the very process of compressing air, even if there's no direct heat transfer, the pure process of compressing it raises the temperature. And for a given pressure, if you raise the temperature, you're reducing the density. And ultimately, that's not good because you want to have the maximum density possible going into the engine so you can put the maximum fuel in there to generate the most power. So you have to be able to sort of cool the air after you compress it to get the density back down. And anything you can do to reduce that is going to be beneficial. The issue with the traditional sort of snail configuration turbocharger, with exactly as you mentioned, you have a radial compressor mated with a radial turbine on a short shaft in between them. The reason why that's a challenge is because this is kind of indicated by the temperature, by the material selection of the turbine. You'll know that the turbine housing is made of like cast iron and like serious, heavy duty metals because it is extremely hot. The exhaust gases which go through that are extremely hot. By putting the compressor immediately next to that heat from the exhaust gases makes its way into the compressor, right? That adds additional heat transfer that makes it even hotter than it would be otherwise, further reducing the density than it would be in other conditions. So if it's in any way possible to physically separate the very, very hot turbine and what you want, the ideally cold compressor on either side of the engine block, that actually can get you a huge benefit in terms of reducing the ambient temperatures of compression. It ultimately will result in higher flow density entering the engine, which means you can have more power That's really all that matters. You're trying to, force air into the engine at a pressure that's above ambient pressure, but you're trying to sort of, use ram induction and sort of, force induction to force as much air as possible into the cylinder in every stroke. And part of that has to do with, how much volume you're moving, but also a part of that is what the density is. And ultimately, splitting the turbo helps to increase the density, which helps to increase power. And there are many things you can do as a consequence of that. Now, one of the mechanical side effects of that is suddenly you have this long shaft connecting the turbine and the compressor. That shaft has dynamics and things associated with itself that actually might be difficult to design out. You don't want to have a mechanical resonance in a long shaft that's spinning. It causes your entire engine to disintegrate if you're not careful. There are any number of mechanical things that had to be solved in order for a split turbo design to make sense. But one of the things that splitting a turbo does do, it's very beneficial, is it allows you to put the MGUH in the V of the engine block, right in between, the compressor side and the turbine side. And there are a number of things associated with that, mass properties and thermal considerations as well, that actually make that a pretty attractive place to put it. Whereas it would be off the back of the engine in the traditional turbo configuration. So it's a challenge mechanically to go from a traditional turbo to a split turbo. But I think Mercedes and others have proven right from the beginning that the advantages of it outweigh any pitfalls.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that we explored it in such depth as well, because it is interesting just to even see it from the inception of, like, I guess the V6 hybrid era, how teams went about it. And then you had teams come along, like, well, not teams, but engine manufacturers like Honda, for example, that then adopted Mercedes split turbo approach as well. And even now, just it doesn't really, although one has its benefits compared to the other, Ferrari still, like, they have quite a good power unit too. And although that might not necessarily have to do with the turbo, it could be to do with the hybrid element, even just the way the engine interacts with this new E10 fuel.
Mm-hmm.
It's still quite intriguing just to see the fine gains and what advantages are to be had with each one. So yeah, really great question on that one too. And I hope you like my Bryson impression too, man. I'm trying to score some points with Georgina for an ice cream endorsement. So as many endorsements as I can get from the guests, well, with that, Bryson.
Yeah, actually, I did have a question for you. I know that you do a lot of sim racing as well, and I imagine you've done several laps around the Miami circuit. What were your thoughts on actually watching sort of the pole position lap or watching some of the actual drivers race the circuit versus when you were racing it? Because I know the turn-in points may be different and the braking might be different. Gear selection. I'm just curious as to what you thought. Your feedback was on watching actual drivers race the circuit.
Absolutely, and great question, Bryson. Thank you for that. And yeah, just kind of putting it into comparison as well. It was really interesting because in the simulator, obviously, you get the base track, which was a very early build of the Miami Grand Prix compared to real life. But yeah, you realize just like how slippy the surface was, and also when you were picking lines through the corners, you had to really pick one line. It wasn't like two ways you could basically approach a corner, because if you went slightly offline onto the marbles, which also nicely replicated even in the sim, you'd be going straight to the scene of the accident. So it's really interesting. And again, just to see this the approach to the qualifying laps, because with Leclerc, you could see that he had a lot more confidence in the first sector. But then confidence is kind of subjective, because Carlos actually had a faster first sector than even Leclerc did. But then in comparison to Max, which, with his more low downforce setup at the moment, he really seemed to struggle with that first sector, which is something I more kind of felt with my first impressions of it. But then you also realize, like, it's very technical too. And like the circuit has so many different flows, because you got these S sections and like blind kind of high speed corners. Then you just got straights, which you've not really got much to do other than the brake bias changes. And then you've got obviously the stadium section where the cars meander. And the hardest thing for me really was just that chicane, because again, just with the new suspension being so stiff, you had to be so accurate just with the way you placed the car over the bumps. And I'm
Hmm.
sure Charles as well was probably getting a bit nervous because he's had a thing with chicanes, probably from Imola, giving him a bit of PSTD there or post-traumatic stress there. So yeah, it was so interesting just to kind of see how it played out in real life in comparison to sim. And even that wall as well, like that 90 degrees turn for the final straight in sector three as well, just how hard you could push up against it without actually touching it or ruining a wheel. And I was thinking that we'd have like a wall of champions moment and a driver would just like slap a wheel in there and rip off a corner. But again, they seem to be on their best behavior because I think they all realize that there's lots of points out there. So it was interesting, and that's the thing I love with the whole sim racing world that we have as well. I mean, it's come a really long way. I've only really been doing it for a year and a half, so I'm still kind of in my infant stages of learning it all and getting the experience. But there's so many things that you pick up on, and one thing actually on the topic of this as well, Bryson, in terms of sim racing, I had like a GT3 race around Barcelona, and one thing I observed is that my front left tire was taking a beating because what the sim was telling me is that after like an hour stint, the front left tire was suffering from blistering and graining. And the only thing I could think of, Bryson, why that could be is because with Barcelona, you've got this long right hander in the first sector, which puts a lot of load on the left tire, which has to travel more. But then on the other parts of the lap, that left front seems to kind of cool down a bit and kind of like I guess like become more ambient like the rest. But then every time you go around that long right hander, you get a lot of thermal wear on that left. So just from a sim racing point back into kind of reality, is that something we could expect to see in Barcelona as well? Like a lot of graining and blistering. And for those maybe that don't know what blistering and graining is it something along the lines of the temperature and just the heat cycle?
Yeah, I fully expect to see a lot of this in Barcelona. There are things you can do to help mitigate it with brake bias, but it's very difficult because there's a pretty hard braking into turn one. It's not just a long and hard turn three, but also turn four is also right hander, and then also the very high speed turn nine. Before that long straight towards the middle part of the lap, all of those corners are extremely taxing on the front left. It certainly is more of a front limited circuit more than a rear limited one, in my view. And you're not accelerating out of slow corners all that much. And in fact, it's that very different nature of the circuit for Barcelona in comparison to, say, Bahrain, that actually was partially responsible for how different the fortunes of McLaren was, right? Between the first preseason test and the second one. After the first preseason test, we sort of thought that McLaren was potentially one of the best teams on the grid, really. And then suddenly their chances sort of evaporated, and we went to Bahrain. A big part of that is circuit configuration. What is the slowest slow speed corner? How many traction zones are there? All so many different factors. I think that Barcelona is going to be a very interesting race, not only in terms of how the teams are going to sort of shake out with their new upgrades that they've brought, whether they work, whether they don't, what's the new running order, but also in terms of how well the teams are dealing with the new regulations. I feel like the new air regulations for 2022 provide the maximum benefit on the exits of high speed corners, right? Where you're following someone and you're trying to make sure that you can stay close to them. Barcelona is the perfect way to check that. And I can assure you that they're in F1 simulations to test whether or not their regulations are working. I can assure you that Barcelona is one of the tracks that they tested around in the simulation. So I'm very much looking forward to the Grand Prix. I think the new regulations will have their perfect test in this upcoming race, and the racing itself, potentially could be quite good. So definitely keep an eye out for that.
Exactly. That's so true. And just to go to our final fan question from this segment, and how I mentioned earlier that I was marinating the FIA, and I was waiting to kind of put them on my nice barbecue grill so I could jerk them like the jerk man at like, a carnival rave. It's that time, Bryce, because, we've had a lot of pants and piercings and another thing as well. Lewis, if you're listening to this, because I know one day you're going to listen, don't take off the bangles, my brother. Wear your jewelry. Wear it because like again, there's a lot of like safety versus the driver's personal kind of like I guess what they need or want or have, but the FIA seem really fixed on this whole like pants and piercings and drivers not being able to wear this and fireproof like underwear and all this stuff. But another thing that's arisen, it's not directly their fault because it's not them that have been doing it. But the question really is, Bryson, is should the FIA be doing something about hashtag Drinksgate? Because another alarming thing that's come out of this Grand Prix, Bryson, and we circled it earlier, was just like how hot, the conditions were. And then obviously with this new generation of cars, there's a lot of them which are overweight. So surprisingly, a lot of drivers came out at the end and were saying that they had no drinks bottle or very little kind of drinking system integrated into the car, all in the name of this saving weight. Like, what's your view on this? And should it be that the FIA should step in and introduce some mandatory like system to stop the teams from, like taking an inch and making a mile with it?
I'm well on record as saying that weight is actually the most one of the most important factors in determining car performance. It's anywhere between 3/10 and 3.5 tenths of a second per lap per 10 kilograms of weight in the car, which is a massive amount, and you can understand why teams are pursuing it so aggressively. Not only in terms of this drinks bottle question, but also shaving paint off their car. Every gram really does matter. It's been the case historically for many years that drivers have suffered the consequences of engineers in order to maximize the performance. They've not had drinks bottles. They've been crammed into cars that are too small for them. They've had all these things, and my position on the whole thing is there's no reason to continue doing this, right? The only thing that needs to change is the status quo. It should no longer be acceptable to require drivers to subject themselves to extreme conditions unnecessarily. They're going to be subjected to them sometimes anyway, just because drink systems fail, right? We've had drink systems fail all the time. There's no reason to do that more than they already will have to do otherwise. And to whatever the weight benefit is that you would have for reducing the water, uh, I would suggest the teams have an agreement to include a minimum water weight, and specifically water weight or hydration weight, adding it to what they currently already have. And essentially, what that would do is it would replace ballast that they put somewhere else in the car with an equivalent weight in hydration. And honestly, I'm very much in favor of that. I don't want drivers to be put under grueling conditions, not being able to even speak for several minutes after the race because they're so dehydrated. There's no knowledge. We don't know what the consequences of this will be. Maybe it won't even be just as much as the driver being dehydrated. Maybe they lose focus and they lose control of the car and crash into a barrier or something, right? We don't know what the consequences will be. Why risk it? Why force this? So I would certainly, as I said before, drivers can make it through races without hydration, but the question is, why should we force them to do that? What do we as fans gain from watching them suffer through that? If it's a matter of saving weight, just change the status quo to allow teams to give drivers this without them feeling that they're paying a penalty in weight. That's really what I think about it.
Exactly. And Bryson, I think you and like many of us agree on that point as well, because we get, the teams are going to push the limits. And, with these new regulations, the teams are probably more desperate than ever to try and seek every single bit performance they can. But, when it's at the livelihood and when it's also at the expense of the driver's health, that should be a number one priority, and yeah, it's just like teams could go and get another driver, like drivers move on, drivers retire, drivers go on to do different series and whatnot, but we don't need to be like seeing them subjected to like really cruel conditions as you mentioned, or their careers also being shortened because of stuff like this too, because even in relation to the porpoising, Russell's talked like quite a few times about it, like him dealing with it because he has to, but in the long term run he's not like positive that this is good for his spine, and that's the thing, like we've seen that Formula One drivers are having longer careers. We've had Kimi Raikkonen, we've had Alonso, Lewis as well. Like he's aging like fine wine, I must say. But he's getting there, and drivers are able to kind of have longer careers. So that's the positive side of it. But then when you have extreme things like this, that also is quite a concern, and there's a balancing act to be had. And I feel like the FIA definitely have bigger fish to fry with things like that than they do necessarily with the things also I mentioned earlier.
Yeah,
So
I
absolutely.
my position on that essentially, I tried to encapsulate it as best I could, but essentially the FIA has concerned itself more with the theoretical or hypothetical dangers of driver jewelry than the clear and present dangers of barrier design. And I think that's the thing that really is most grating, is that you are concerned primarily with something that could potentially happen and ignoring quite clearly things that are actually happening in reality. A real danger is always more important than a hypothetical one. So I just think that they need to reevaluate their position and make a decision that makes sense in the light of history.
So true, very true. And yeah, the fan section this week's been phenomenal. I'm really, really impressed with the quality of questions there. That was amazing. And that moves us on then to the next segment, which is obviously, Bryson, as you know, my quirky fantasy section. So I always throw you a curveball. I always kind of give you like a hypothetical. So I want you to imagine this one, Bryson. So you've been obviously on Sky Sports F1. Stefano Dominicali and Ross Brawn have seen your excellent feature. And they say, you know what? We need to get this guy. We need this guy to commission, wait for it, the first ever Formula One race at the Indianapolis 500 oval circuit. So I'm gonna let that sink in. Bryson, the question is, what would be the technical or even the aerodynamical like shortfalls or challenges you would have to face just to kind of make even a Formula One race with this generation of car possible around like a high speed oval in that scenario? And is it possible? Like, I know anything's possible, but like, what considerations would the FIA and just maybe Pirelli and maybe the teams have to take into account to make like an Indy 500 but for Formula One cars possible?
This really isn't as hypothetical as you think, because for many years the U.S. Grand Prix was held at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. It only used the first corner and the main straight from the oval track, but it used the rest of the infield. But they actually were there for several years, and as you may or may not know, my very first exposure to Formula One was the 2005 U.S. Grand Prix at Indianapolis, right? And
Michelin.
and that Michelin question is the exact answer to the question you are posing, which is what would be the technical and engineering challenges for Formula One cars to race on that type of a circuit. And fundamentally, what it comes down to is this: Formula One cars make too much downforce. Formula One cars make an extraordinary amount of downforce. They generate vertical loads that are, 3.5 times their weight at top speed. So if you were to take that amount of aerodynamic loading and add on to that the centrifugal loading that comes as a result of running on a banked surface at very high speed, suddenly the loads that the wheels are exposed to, especially the rear wheels, are exposed to could quickly exceed the potential for the current designs to be able to handle. Now, I imagine that things might be slightly different in 2022 than they were in 2005 or 2007 or whatever. Especially given the wheel size and the change in the tire flex because of the low profile tires, there may be a way for it to make sense and for it to work. But broadly speaking, that's the limiting factor. The limiting factor is shedding enough of the downforce on the cars to be able to actually run them on a banked circuit. We have transient loading now in F1. If you think about, going up Eau Rouge, for example, you have significant compression there, but it's not sustained. It's only for a brief second, and then it's immediately counteracted by the car being unloaded at the top of Radion, right? Whereas if you go through the high speed corners at Indianapolis, not only is it positive loading in one direction at each time, but it's a very long, sustained corner. There's a tremendous amount of opportunity to build temperature in the tire, in addition to the load, and not to be able to dissipate it. That has been the biggest issue with running at Indianapolis. Now, there have been meetings with Ben Sulayem and the people from IMS talking about, quote unquote, shared interests. We don't know what that might mean in the future, but it could easily happen that Formula One comes back to Indianapolis. And I know a great many fans would be in favor of that. It's a very different feel from Miami or Austin or even Las Vegas. So it's certainly something that could happen. The main technical challenge is just being able to run F1 cars on banked curves. They just need to shed a lot more downforce, and the tire construction needs to be rethought to make sure it makes sense. But it certainly could happen.
Okay, well, I mean, it's fascinating to know and just to hear the considerations as well, Bryson. Because yeah, I remember that 2005 Indianapolis thing too, which was yeah, interesting watching six Bridgestone. I think it was two Ferraris. I think it was a Minardi.
There were two Ferraris, two Jordans, and two Minardis. And if
Ah,
anything, this should give you the ultimate indication of how hardcore I am as a Formula One fan. My first exposure to Formula One was a 2005 U.S. Grand Prix, and I never looked back. Now, that should tell you everything you need to know about how much I love
dedicated.
this sport.
Yeah, because it left a sour taste in the mouth of many, Bryson, and I don't blame the fans either, because it was a disaster in terms of just what actually happened, how the fans were treated, and just it was even just watching it on TV. I must have been what 2000. I was 10 years old. Wow, how time flies. But yeah,
Yeah,
just
but it was tough. But I have to be said, the what always has stood out to me about Formula One is the performance of the cars. That's the incredible performance, and that was not diminished at all
sure.
in that race. And I think that's what really impressed me, and it always has. So yes, it may have been a farce, and it may have been a historic race for all the wrong reasons, but I still had a great time there.
Excellent. And also another kind of thing you said there as well, Bryson, I wanted to grab onto. You mentioned that Formula One cars make an immense, like an immense needs to probably be emphasized as well, like level of downforce. There's always this thing about like Formula One cars like generate so much downforce they could run upside down in a wind tunnel. Like, is that actually true, or is that like like yeah, like a bit of a kind of like thing?
No, they can definitely do it, and if anything, they're not selling it enough.
Okay.
People seem to think that if you had a Formula One car at maximum speed and in perfect conditions, you would just be able to make enough downforce to match their own weight in the wind tunnel, and it's just not true. They could generate, 3.5 or maybe even 4 times their own weight and downforce at maximum speed if you were in a Monaco spec downforce configuration. And in fact, if you had a Monaco configuration and maybe light fuel, so the car was lighter, you could probably generate your own weight and downforce at like 190 kilometers per hour, maybe even a little less. I don't really know. But it's not just as possible. It's actually easy.
Wow.
It's actually easy.
That's interesting. You know what, Bryson? Again, I'm going to save this for the next time you're up there, but I'm going to give you a head start on the answer. Could we have an upside down Formula? I'm joking. I'm not going to finish. You knew where I was going with that, but yeah, I don't. I don't think.
You could definitely. Here's what I'd recommend. I would recommend robotic cars. I would recommend electric motors, so you don't have to worry about inverse fuel pumps and all that other stuff. And I would recommend a Grand Prix that was just raced remotely. You could definitely do it, and trust me, I've thought about it more than I should.
Bryce, we might have to come together and plan something. You might be onto something there. You might be ahead of the curve. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, and just to kind of round it up then, because we've pretty much come full circle in this episode. Barcelona, Bryson. We've kind of touched on it a couple of times throughout this episode, but there are a lot of rumors going around about teams bringing upgrades, Ferrari bringing a new package, which might give them free temps, Mercedes as well, expecting to regain maybe their losses as well, and probably going to bring a huge major upgrade to match and kind of I guess almost have a comparison to the stuff they have in the wind tunnel and obviously the data they had earlier on in the year. What are your expectations from this Grand Prix, from the teams, any innovations, any upgrades, and also just the racing as well in terms of these new cars, having watched them up close and personal?
Whenever I see a news story that says X team is bringing a major upgrade to Spain, I say, great, that's fun. It's just not news. It's not news. It's not news. Every team is going to be bringing something major for Spain, and we've known that for every year. It's the same thing. They bring massive upgrades. I am not envious of Sam Collins this weekend. He's going to have his work cut out for him, going over every single, not this weekend, but Barcelona. When you're going over every single car and tracking every single change that they've made, he's going to have a long a long day. I'll have to take some pictures to check myself later. But no, they're all going to bring upgrades. They're all going to be very likely going to be improvements. What matters is not how much faster the car is in Barcelona than it was in Miami. What matters is how fast is it relative to the other cars,
Mhm.
right? That's the thing that matters. It's the old adage. You and your friend are running away from a bear. You don't have to outrun the bear. You just have to outrun your friend.
True.
Right. So I expect there to be some relative changes in the absolute pace of the cars. I expect there to be some good racing as well. As I said before, the new regulations are really tailor made to improve the racing at a track like Barcelona. All the cars will be faster by some degree. It's just not clear yet who's going to be the fastest. If Mercedes has learned something from their experiments in the past few races, Barcelona will probably be their best opportunity to exercise that knowledge in a way that improves their pace. I know there are some cynics that think that Mercedes just runs their car at a high power mode and low fuel whenever they do well on one of these intermediate practice sessions. But I think the more likely thing is that this car is actually hilariously hard to set up correctly. It's incredibly sensitive to not only its own setup, but tire temperatures and even wind and all kinds of things that you don't have direct control over. I think the more Mercedes learns, the better position it'll be in. And they really have just had some struggles extracting the most out of their car. Barcelona will be the best opportunity for them to show us what they've got.
Absolutely. And yeah, just it's really interesting because like you mentioned there as well, like I guess it's the first back to back, and just even as the fans or like some of the fans, they're like, bring an upgrade here, bring an upgrade there. You said you're gonna bring, like, it reminds me of like the cat meme where like the cat's at one side of the table and the woman's at the other side of the table, and Toto's like the cat saying, yeah, we're gonna bring upgrades, and then the woman on the other side of the table is like, you said you were gonna bring upgrades next week, and kind of the pressures that come with that because we just want them to do well, obviously. But yeah, like it's a real test, really, because again, they're kind of going back to a circuit they've already got data on, and it will be interesting to see how far they've moved forward from such time to now as well. And then even in terms of the racing too, I think for the FIA, this is also a big race because they've harbored on about, this new generation of car making it easier to follow and so forth. Barcelona, as I found out earlier in my esports race, is ridiculously hard to overtake. Even in a GT3 car that has much more simplified aerodynamic configurations, it was really tough. You have to almost pressure people into making mistakes or try and play the strategy game, which is obviously a very integral part of Formula One too. So, yeah, very, very, very excited. And then I believe we've got. I'm gonna check whilst I'm speaking to you, Bryson, but I'm pretty sure we got Monaco the week after, like literally the week after, right?
Yeah, and I actually do have a surprise to reveal, perhaps exclusive to the show. Would you like to hear it?
Yes, Bryson, come on. You know we love an exclusive here at Stripping the Dip in. Of course.
So my intention really was to go to the Miami Grand Prix, and that was a very one-off thing. It was not planned 2 months ago, but I did end up going, and I had a great experience. I can reveal here on this podcast that I actually will be going to the Montreal Grand Prix as well
Yes.
in about a month. That has been a very impromptu change in plans, but I will be there, and I look forward to seeing anyone who happens to go.
Oh, that's super news, Bryson. I'm super excited to hear that and ecstatic for you because again, like I feel like there's not enough of us kind of in our circle that actually go out to these races. And even just from your Miami experience, there was so much I took away, and it was so intriguing just to get your perspective being trackside. And again, Canada has always been a great circuit for motor racing with Formula One. It's provided us with lots of amazing races. I'm sure people will probably think about Jenson Button in 2011 with, the last lap overtake on Sebastian. But that's awesome. I'm really glad. Are you going under like your own capacity, or you potentially go in, with a young Sky Sports, or what's the
No,
deal?
no, I am the beneficiary of someone else's largesse and kind will. I have been, allowed to go because someone would like for me to go and meet some people, potentially, with some teams. So we'll see how that all works out.
Ah, Bryson, I am over the moon for you. You know what? Because you deserve it. And I always like when I have discussions with you. It's funny, like speaking about you in front of you. Like when I have discussions about you to like to other people, like the first thing that people always say is he's so generous with his knowledge. Like there's a lot of people there that have intel on stuff and like they'll make you feel like you're a lesser person for not knowing, or they're kind of like stingy with it, but you, on the other hand, you're always generous, you're always giving, you're always understanding. And the thing I love about many things with you, Bryson, is you break it in a way that us mortals can actually understand and rationalize and actually apply, to real life situations and stuff like that too. So I regard you as a star. Georgina regards you as a star. All of us regard you as a star. And honestly, I'm so humbled and really blessed, to have you here today, and also to know that you're getting these opportunities as well, because you fully deserve them. But also, like,
Thank you very much.
you're more than welcome. And other than that as well, Bryson, is there anything else that you'd want us to shout out, or is there any other projects that you're working on that we can like follow?
I don't have anything that I can reveal at this particular moment, but
Okay.
like I said, I'm a huge fan of the sport, and any opportunity that I have to talk about it and learn more about it, I'm always open to. If anything else fun and exciting happens, I'll be sure to let you know.
Perfect. Well, guys, you heard it from us first at Stripping the Dipping. You see Georgina, she's the boss, and you see me. I'm changing it from AMG Denz to DJ Denz because I just be out here recording bangers like DJ Khaled, and like just in the great words of DJ Khaled, we the best. So make sure you subscribe to our new YouTube channel, of course, that's up and running now. Make sure, of course, you follow Natural Paradigm Bryson Sullivan, because he's worked on some amazing things, and I'm sure it's going to bring us even more amazing content in the future. And as we also always say, Bryson, as well, thank you. We really appreciate your time. It means so much to us. And again, we'll be looking forward to getting you on another episode, like when we maybe have some more things to talk about, or more radical kind of packages that come out. Again, FIA seem to be in some sort of bust up or saga every week, so that gives us a lot of room for discussion as well on the technical or not so technical, and yeah, just me and my wacky theoretical questions as well. So we love those. But of course, for those listening at home, we hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you liked it, please make sure that you like and that you share, and that you obviously give us any feedback, because we're always willing to take it on board. And yeah, until next time, it's been your boy AMG Dent with Bryson Sullivan, Georgina Donna, and this has been Stripping the Dipping. See you soon.
Take care of yourself. Bye.
All right, you too. Bye bye.